Good morning to everyone and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. And I actually have coffee today, not green juice or lemon juice or whatever. I had lemon juice last week, I think. At any rate, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the rule of law. But before we launch into that, I want to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. We gather each Friday. We know we have some new people with us this morning, so welcome. And here's how this goes. We have lots of people chatting away over here in the chat, and that's awesome. We encourage that. And we know that as Joanne discusses the rule of law topic today, you're going to have lots of great questions. If you look towards the bottom of your screen, those questions go in the Q&A box. I'll be back in about 30 minutes and we will take your questions. We'll see you in a little bit.
And as I suggested a moment ago, when probably some of you weren't here, well, actually two things. So make sure when you're chatting, we have a very lively, chatty community. When you're chatting, make sure that you have made it so your comments are going to everybody and not just to panelists or whatever the other options are. You want everyone to see in what you're going to say. And also, if you're here for the first time, and I suspect there may be some people who are here for the first time, because I think some people have sort of heard about this for the first time in the news last week that my podcast with Heather will be ending soon, which I'm sorry about, but I will not discuss during this episode. But if you are here for the first time, please say something in chat to the community because they will give you a hearty welcome, because we've been doing this for over 3 years and this is an amazing community. I can remember my third grade friend, but I forget what I saw 2 seconds ago. I believe I saw that this is the 179th straight episode, I believe. Yes, 179. Thank you, Carolee. I see that on the bottom of the screen. Okay, so we have a hearty community after all of that time. So tell us and you will be welcomed. Okay, so as ever, there I was on Thursday trying to decide what we should be talking about today. And a number of things crossed my mind. I decided on the rule of law and democracy in part because it occurred to me, and I suggested this in the tweet that I toot and post and spout everything else that I sent out, that we've been hearing a lot about issues that surround the rule of law, even if we have not necessarily been thinking about that phrase. And I was thinking particularly of just in the last day or two, I suppose, there's been discussion of the fact that some of the leading Proud Boys have received sentences for what they did on January 6th. I added to that the simple fact that when former President Trump's trial takes place, has certainly been in the news, is going to be, I suspect, an ongoing story. And part of that story has to do with the trial versus the lead up to the next presidential election, which in a sense comes down to the rule of law and the democratic electoral, small d democratic electoral process. So for all of these reasons, in one way or another, we are surrounded by questions that have to do with the rule of law, and I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. So I thought we can begin to address this, at least right now in this episode. I'm sure it will come up again, but the rule of law, generally speaking, is something that it's one of those phrases that is tossed out and that we have a vague sense of what it means, but I think generally speaking, we don't always need to, or actually then thus think about the implications of it. What do we mean when we say rule of law? How has that been, how has it evolved or been addressed over time in history? And then how should we be thinking about it today? Because indeed we should be thinking about it today. Good, hard thoughts, because as I suggested in the title of this episode, which I think it was something about the rule of law and democracy, and how I said you can't have one without the other. And then a historian colleague said, well, unfortunately, you can have the rule of law without democracy, but you cannot have democracy without the rule of law. So at any rate, democracy in many ways is under threat And the rule of law is two. We just have talked a lot more here about democracy than about the rule of law. Okay, so as ever, we begin with definitions. Always a handy place to start. And the rule of law, on the one hand, has some basic, like just casting about online, like what does the American Bar Association say? What does the federal court's website say? They share certain sort of prerequisites for what they consider to be the rule of law in a very general way before we get to those. They say that, the basic premise of the rule of law is that no one is above the law, and that the law rules through public and legitimate laws that apply to everyone. Now, the U.S. federal courts website, uscourts.gov, lays out this sort of three components that a lot of other institutions trying to define the rule of law state. So according to their website, the rule of law is a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to laws that are, number one, publicly promulgated, number two, equally enforced, number three, independently adjudicated. So those three things, pretty much in one way or another, are the consistent things that people say about the rule of law. They're public knowledge. They're something, they're not hidden, they're not sneaky, it's publicly known. They are enforced equally. I'm going to come back to that point momentarily. And there's an independent judiciary that can decide cases, legal cases, without necessarily being influenced by the legislature, that they have the ability to independently judge questions of law. So that's, generally speaking, the definition. Another point that's worth making here, and I'm going to be talking about two different instances that I suppose one could say have to do with the rule of law. They're different, and they have to do with other things as well, but they're the two things that popped into my mind when I thought about this topic yesterday and decided on it. But before I do that, I did think also of a very simple statement. I know I've tossed it off in social media of various forms before, and it comes from Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he says basically that in America, the law is king, right? And this is drawing a very important contrast between rule of law versus the rule of one person, right? A monarchy, there's a king or queen who is at the top, the peak of the system, and has a power that ideally in the United States, one person doesn't have. That in the United States, the law is king. In monarchies, the king or queen is king and not necessarily the law. Now that's a bold statement, that's an overly general statement, but you can see the larger point I'm making here is that the United States as a government of law, of laws not men in that sense, it matters. And that goes all the way back. Common Sense was in 1776. So in the United States, at least, particularly given that we, at this period, we're talking about colonies which are, they have a legal and political status in relation to the mother country. That's for the most part paper bound. I think I said maybe last time, or else I did it during my podcast. Forgive me, people. I talk a lot and sometimes I forget where I've said something before, but I did talk about somewhere in the last week, colonists being paper minded because colonial charters on paper, they had a sense of who they were and what their rights were on paper in a way that perhaps others in the mother country did not. And what that means is constitutions and other such paper documents of laws and rights really mattered to an even greater degree. Colonists and then Americans were very aware of them. Okay, so that's the general idea of the rule of law. Democracy requires the rule of law in part because it does say that people should be, I'll come back to that should again momentarily, equal under the law, that there is a set of laws that it applies equally to all of us, that actually that same set of laws, constitutional, if you're talking, and as opposed to from a legislature, laws dictate how, for example, elections run, that the rule of law, ultimately, it's about the law, but it's also about citizens in a nation being able to choose leaders. More important than that, accountability. And I've talked about this a few million times here on History Matters, but At the heart of democracy is the idea of accountability, that people who you give political power to are accountable for how they use or misuse that power. And the rule of law is a method of enforcing accountability. If you break the law, if you misuse power, if you use power that you have been given corruptly, then you should be held accountable for that in some way. And one way would be through losing your office through an election, but the rule of law applies as well. So accountability, if your political leaders are not accountable to you or to the law, that is not a democratic form of government. That is a form of government in which a person has unlimited, or to some degree, unlimited power. That is not what we're supposed to be here in the United States. It's why we have constitutional governance. It's why we have a constitution that very clearly sets limits as to the kinds of power that different branches of government have. It's why we have checks and balances. It's why our government functions as it does. And if you are trying to suggest that one individual is somehow above the law because of that person having a lot of, or having had a lot of power, that's not holding that person accountable. That's acting against simple principles of democracy. And that's part of our ongoing, the ongoing threat against democracy in the United States. So the rule of law, although it sounds like kind of a rote phrase, is actually part of the bundle of things that keep a democracy from, you need the rule of law to keep a democracy from unraveling. It keeps us not necessarily equal. We'll come back actually right to the should before I go back into the 18th century, which is where I want to end up. But some of you are probably thinking now, and certainly when I was composing this topic, I thought the same thing. On the one hand, I'm saying the rule of law means we should all be treated equally under the law. On the other hand, we could all argue there are many ways in which not all Americans are treated equally under the law. And sometimes that's a matter of wealth, but sometimes that's a matter of race, right? I'm going to say the dreaded phrase, critical race theory, which actually is not something taught in nursery schools. It's not something found in children's books. It actually has to do with the law. It actually relates to today's topic. The idea of critical race theory is something that really is taught in law schools, and it has to do with the fact of the many ways in which our legal system and other institutions within the country are in some ways geared to, or at least being implemented in a way that is racially unjust. That's what it is. So we can sit here and say, if you're a white American, you may have different assumptions about how the law is going to play out in regard to you than if you're a Black American. And, you know, we know that in any number of ways. That's what critical race theory is actually about. And that's a fact. So on the one hand, the rule of law is central to democracy. On the other hand, it isn't necessarily always enforced as it should be. And I've said before that democracy isn't an end point. You don't get to democracy and then suddenly put on the brakes and say, we've arrived, we're at democracy. It's a process, and it's an ongoing process. And improving it and correcting it is an ongoing process. And some of what I'm talking about here regarding race is part of that, has to be part of that ongoing process. But regardless, the general idea that the rule of law is essential for democratic governance prevails. And that's, again, true for former presidents as well as for anybody else. Now, the two things that came to mind when I was thinking about the rule of law, two early legal cases that, one involving John Adams, one involving Alexander Hamilton, both for the people involved, in one way or another, involved their idea that, and again, they didn't necessarily use the phrase the rule of law, but the idea that the law should apply equally to all, that people deserve a fair trial, that the law of nations should carry between nations, the idea of the law being deployed fairly, and particularly because one of these incidents takes place in 1770, the other in 1784, particularly at a point when the United States actually first didn't exist and then was on its way to its modern format, but didn't yet have a constitution. In these early years, many Americans, and particularly legal-minded Americans, were very aware of the fact that they needed to prove to Americans and to the larger world that this new country or that these colonists were rule of law bound, that they were going to meet standards that the rest of the world had. And for many people, surpass those standards, but certainly the idea was to prove to the world that whatever's going on in the United States, that there are principles that are being bound to. The rule of law is one of them. Now, in the case of John Adams, I'm talking about, some of you have probably already guessed this, the Boston Massacre trial of the soldiers who fired on colonists, Massachusetts colonists in 1770, in March of 1770. And it was, I won't go into the long story of it, but it was caused essentially by, was already animosity and protests of various sorts happening in Boston. There were British troops, an increasing presence of British troops in Boston that really had colonists angry and resentful and defensive, and an incident that was initially between a handful of people very quickly magnified isn't the word I'm looking for, but accelerated into becoming something very big, so that you had a lot of people in the street very upset at British soldiers who supposedly had bullied someone, and you end up with a group of colonists standing in front of a group of British soldiers, and it's, at the time, certainly was unclear what happened. Someone said or heard the word fire, and the British soldiers opened fire on the colonists and killed several people. And obviously, I mentioned a few weeks ago, I believe, how shocking Lexington and Concord were. The news of the outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord, because American colonists had to reckon with the fact that their own government had fired on colonists, British subjects, and that was shocking. This had that same ring to it. The British soldiers, British regulars, had fired on and killed colonists at a moment where there was already a lot of tension. It was a big deal, and obviously had caused even more animosity, hostility, outrage. The reason why this came to mind, of course, is that John Adams, a lawyer at the time, decided to defend the British soldiers who had fired upon the colonists. He was a co-counsel, actually. Josiah Quincy, I believe, Jr., also was defending the soldiers. Adams, who was always very law-minded, and by that I mean he tended to think of a lot about broader principles, broader ideas and ideals. He was an intellectual thinker of a sort that sometimes gets overlooked in people's tendency to focus on him as a sort of cantankerous, irritable guy. And I know I always talk about him as the founder with the best sense of humor, so I'm partly guilty of this, but his broader thinking about the law is significant, and this is one example of that. He later said that he considered his defense of the British soldiers, quote, one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country, because he upheld principles of justice and the right to a fair trial, regardless of the circumstances. So that was why he stepped forward and undertook this case, because that idea of the rule of law, principles of justice, the right to a fair trial, he wanted to stand up at this moment when it would have been very easy to not, considering the state of emotion in Massachusetts, to not stand up. And he did a number of things in his life that made him unpopular, and he tended to feel particularly good about those things because he did them despite unpopularity, because he felt that they were important, that he was being responsible, and this is a key one. So that was the first thing that came to mind, was Adams realizing the simple fact of having someone step up and defend these soldiers who had killed these colonists was an important fact, had something to do with a broader understanding throughout the colonies, and perhaps even more broadly back to the mother country. The rule of law applied. Principles were being applied, that there were standards being met, and he was standing up as a colonist, a lawyer, to defend those standards. Excuse me. The other example that came to mind for me, and it has a similar kind of tone and temperament and logic to it, took place in 1784, and ultimately ended up being the legal case Rutgers v. Waddington. And in this case, Alexander Hamilton was standing up and defending a Tory. Now, the story behind Rutgers v. Waddington is after the American Revolution, the New York State legislature enacted laws that essentially stripped Tories of their right of property and privilege, meaning in one such case, the 1783 Trespass Act gave patriots the legal right to sue people who had occupied, damaged, or destroyed homes that they had left behind British lines during the war. Okay, so the idea is that American, particularly in New York, colonists flee with the British taking over New York. British come to use some of the buildings that are left behind, and the Trespass Act says, no, we can, in one way or another, you Tories are going to pay for what you did. Now, Hamilton litigates the defense, and he says, no, wait a minute, actually, we need to think about broader ideas about law. We need to think, for example, about the Treaty of Paris of 1783, year before, that sets in play certain laws and standards that would be violated by the Trespass Act. And that treaty should be treated as law. It's, in a sense, a world level law. It's the law of nations, and that matters. And thus standing up for the Tory, who in this particular case was being charged for, I guess she had a brewery house, was what she was being charged about, that she had rights that this larger law, and I also, again, ideally understood in a broad sense as the rule of law, protected her against. So Adams and Hamilton in both cases came to mind because these were two people who stood up and said, it would be easy to side with public sentiment. It would be easy to not even step forward, right? It's very clear what people writ large would want to happen at this given moment. And both of them stood up and said, no, but it's really actually important to impose some kinds of legal standards, to say that legal standards apply, particularly in a new nation or particularly in colonies. Someone has to stand up and show that they're in force. Hamilton, in Federalist number 78, also talks about the importance of an independent judiciary, that it can decide cases based on the rule of law without being affected by legislatures, for example. I think I had a quote from that here, but perhaps I didn't. Hamilton defines ultimately the judicial branch as the least dangerous branch of the new national government, which thinking about the evolution of these ideas over time is quite interesting. But at the time, he saw it as being key, as being important. It's why it had to be discussed, why it's talked about in the Constitution, why standards are set, excuse me, and why he felt the need to step forward and explain particularly why an independent judiciary is important in the Federalist essays that he wrote about it. So that's a lot that I fit into 27 minutes, I believe. But my larger point here is that the rule of law as a broad idea matters. And it's going to matter, already does, and increasingly will become an issue of public debate as we see dates for various trials concerning former President Trump and the coming election. As that discussion continues to heat up, the trial date, the trials generally, the fact that the former president is subject to those trials deserves to be tried for these alleged crimes. That's a fundamental of the rule of law, right? That no one can do something, and particularly a former president on that scale, and assume that the law doesn't apply to him and her. The law does apply. No one is above the law, not even a former president. And that's part of what is being contested now when people talk about what should or shouldn't happen to the former president, what's allowable or not allowable, or the idea that somehow what's happening right now as far as legal charges against the former president has something to do with weaponized justice or weaponized government. If you allegedly violate the law, you deserve a fair trial, but you're not above trial, right? You deserve a fair trial. To say that there is evidence, a lot of evidence that this thing has happened, that now there should be a trial about this thing to determine if it happened, what happened, how it happened, and what the implications are, that's our judicial system, right? That's a right. That's a privilege that we have in the United States that people don't necessarily have in some other countries. That matters. But to say that that's secondary in some way to other things, even to an election, that's a problematic statement, right? To say that, oh, we'll put off justice, we'll put off considering this till after the election. We need to think really carefully about the idea that in one way or another, the rule of law and the idea that the law applies to everyone can be delayed because of an election. Now, that said, I realize that there are ways in which things can be timed deliberately to affect elections. I'm not going to make a statement here that one should always do X, Y, and Z, but I am going to say that assuming that there's a simple formula that says put all of this off until after the election because the election matters most, it's a dangerous thing to say that the simple idea that you are not above the law can be just put off, and that then you're going to elect someone who has the power to enforce or not enforce the rule of law, right? We're facing a crisis of many levels here in the United States, continuing to face, and democracy is under threat in any number of ways. Accountability is under threat in any number of ways. Now we're seeing, not in a new way, but in a more obvious way, how the rule of law is also being debated, in some ways being questioned, how it's going to be implemented, if it's going to be implemented, and what are the broader implications of that. That is some of what we are facing and will particularly continue to face in the months leading up to the next presidential election. So I'm laying it out here partly so that as this discussion heats up, rather than dismissing it as a legal issue versus a political issue, that we all understand that those things are intertwined. It's not one versus the other, that the rule of law and democracy are intertwined, and that if you're doing something that affects the equal application of the law to all Americans, that's a legal issue and it's a political issue, and it's one that obviously will have something to do with how we proceed in coming months with this coming election. Certainly it's going to, I can't remember where I read the headline today that, somewhere, now that's going to dominate, right? Now the trials are going to dominate the coming presidential election. We'll see how that unfolds. Perhaps that's true. Just don't make the mistake of assuming that trials and law are in their own separate box and should be put off to the side, because that's simply not the way that democracy works. Okay, I'm 2 minutes over. I haven't seen the mug on the bottom of the screen. Those of you who are new here, what I have been doing for 179 different weeks, which I don't have 179 coffee mugs, but what I have been doing is I have a mug related to the theme that we discuss, that at the end of every episode, it is mugalicious time, says Cece, that I hold up at the end of my comments and before we move on to questions, thematically tied. Now, you're going to have to travel a little bit with me down the road on this one, because it's going to look like a black mug. So trust me on this one. So it's a black mug. It actually, you might be able to make out that it says, my lipstick is bad. It says Hamilton fired first. It's a Burr Hamilton duel mug. Dueling was illegal. And if you were not an elite person, you often were charged with the crime of dueling. But if you were an elite person, you tended to get away with it. So dueling is an example of messing with the rule of law. I found a way to bring, and I have to tell you, I stood in front of my mug cabinet for a while thinking, oh my gosh, the rule of law. Thank you, Annie. That's exactly it. And then I was like, dueling, I got it. And you won't believe me that that's what it does. It is. And I believe NCHE used to sell this. This is an NCHE mug. So not only does it say Hamilton fired first, but it says NCHE on the bottom there. Anyway, okay, I will stop talking now so that we can open things up more broadly to a discussion.
Is that one of those ones where when you pour something hot in it, the words, okay.
Yes, that it appears. And I didn't have a full cup of coffee this morning. So all I got when I poured my coffee in was NCHE.
You might need a science experiment during the after party so you can do the mug reveal. Okay, well, we have questions. Some of these are very long, guys. I'm going to have to do the Reader's Digest version, and we're not going to get to very many. There's like paragraphs this week. Okay. Daniel asks, he makes a reference to a show, Chuck, which I know was a TV show, but I never saw it. But he said that he thought of the show Chuck, places where law is perverted to make democracy illegal and deny folks their basic rights. He used the example of Putin making arbitrary laws. He says machinations of SCOTUS and red state legislators, languages of MAGA mirrors on the people who are fighting the abuses of the prior two examples. He asks, when folks are immune to looking for facts, how do we argue for public protest against wrong laws versus enforcing the rule of law for a just law? And he says he knows people who try to compare January 6th to Antifa protesters in Portland. That was a very long question.
That is a very long question. I'm going to come back later to what the heck is Chuck? And I know like a lot of popular culture. I don't know. If the larger question feels like it's, what do you do when you don't agree on facts? And you're dealing with the rule of law. Is that kind of underlying?
He says, when we're immune to looking for facts, how do we argue for public protest against bad laws or wrong laws versus enforcing the rule of law and just laws?
It makes me think of, yet again, a tweet. I think my colleague Tim Snyder, at some point, what feels like a million years ago, talked about how if you are in a crisis of facts, if people can't agree on facts, that's a threat to democracy and the rule of law, and which indeed it is, right? And you can see how if you can't even fundamentally agree on basic facts, causes, and I see people all on the bottom here. I see Amazon Prime. So you're explaining what Chuck is, and I can't see it. So we're gonna have to do it in the after party. But at any point, anyway, the point of facts and having an inability or an I can't remember the word was just used, but so people are disinclined to look at or search for facts.
Immune.
What was the word?
He said immune. They're immune to looking for facts.
Right. That's different, but yeah, it's even more interesting. Immune to looking for facts. That's a crisis. It's a crisis in many ways, and it is a crisis for democracy. I don't have the answer to that, the solution to that. Here is the answer. I think it's worth noting, and you have to stand up and protest and voice what you have to say. Give your voice and your vote in a way that shows that you're aware of these sorts of things that are going on that are violating democracy or the rule of law. But it's an absolute fundamental correct assumption that I do not have the answer to, that if we can't agree on basic facts, some pretty standard ground level rules about law and government become problematic. And unfortunately, technology is guaranteeing that this is going to get worse before it gets better. Right. And we don't have to talk about AI or anything else, but I remember many moons ago, people were upset because you could do things with video to make things appear that they happened and they didn't. Right. And I remember a million years ago thinking, ooh, that could be dangerous. I could be made to say something that I never said, or something could be, made to appear that it happened without actually happening. And all of that is true. That said, we are also at a point where we can all sit at home and watch what happened on January 6th. And then someone could say it was a typical day of tourism. And the assumption is some people will believe that or want to believe that. So the crisis of facts, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of the rule of law, they're all part of the same issue, but one of them has a technological component, and I don't have the answer to how to solve that. All I can say is that question is a smart question because the awareness of this fact is really important. To be aware that we're in a world where you actually have to think about facts, prove facts, consider the place of facts, worry about assumptions being made based on things that aren't proven facts. I mean, that's a part of the legal and political time that we are in.
Okay. Kathleen asks, what are your thoughts on those who say they believe the rule of law, but they think it's being unfairly applied to both the Trump and the Biden families?
Well, unfairly applied, it depends on the applied, what that means, right? So on the one hand, you can say, this should happen or this shouldn't happen, like maybe, Kushner should be charged with things, or maybe Hunter Biden should or shouldn't be charged with things. The shoulds or shouldn'ts are less important than what actually happens, right? So as far as what's fair or unfair, again, ideally, you have a judicial system that is implemented in fair, standardized ways so that, and that people deserve a fair trial. So that if someone is unjustly charged with something, you have a system in place that will allow that to either be quashed as being unfair or tried in a court that can prove there isn't evidence and thus it can't be proven. We've seen the many ways in which the last presidential election kept being attacked again and again and challenged in court in one way or another. And again and again and again, people saying, yeah, no, there's no evidence. I know there's no evidence. That was, essentially this principle in play.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions from our friend Gloria, because I think they relate. She's asking your thoughts on if Trump can get a fair trial with all the media evidence against him. She says the media is, in her opinion, convicting him except for Fox, and they're being criticized. And she wanted to know if you would call this a show trial. Can democracy have show trials, or is the opposition too principled for that?
I mean, I personally believe that anyone can get a fair trial, because at the same time that some of the public you could say is biased against him, and some of the public you could say is really biased for him. So it is true that people have very strong feelings about him, but we do have ways in which trials proceed and jurors are picked. And I believe in our system of justice. I don't think it's going to be an easy thing, but I do think it's possible. To say that that's not possible is essentially to say that he's above the rule of law, and I don't believe that. And I think there are other cases in which, again, not necessarily a former president, but someone seems to have done something so notorious and horrible, particularly on a local level, that it might seem impossible to get that person a fair trial. And I don't believe that. I believe that the judicial system, in the way that it finds its way into choosing jurors and questioning jurors and tracking jurors. I took part I was a juror in a trial that had a seemingly obvious outcome, and we did not end up choosing the outcome that everyone thought was inevitable. And I will never forget the shocked gasp in the courtroom when our decision, like, not guilty. So I do think it's possible, because what I saw in that case, and even though it's anecdotal in one incident, what I saw was a room full of people who really, really, really cared about making this trial fair. We didn't agree with each other. We didn't agree politically, although this was so long ago that we weren't living in the political times that we're in now, but still, it's a group of diverse people with different views. And we really, really, really wanted to try and do the right thing as a group, to a degree that although I hated taking part in that trial, it left me feeling really good about our legal system, because I had never seen it from the inside in that way before. And seeing jurors who were so committed, and we all knew that no one was going to like, here's a case, right? We all knew no one was going to like the decision we came to, but we had to come to this decision because we didn't feel that you could prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And in that case, because we had doubts, and because the prosecutor had been a little lazy in this case, we couldn't find guilt. We did what we thought we should do. That's encouraging, right? That's how the system is supposed to work. And I believe, I think Heather and I, in some recent episode, maybe in the most recent episode of our podcast, talked in the backstage component about how we both fundamentally believe in democracy. And I fundamentally, on a certain level, agree in our judicial system. It's imposed incorrectly and unfairly all the time, but it can be, and often is, something that really is admirable in what it aims to do. As I said earlier, nothing is a done deal, and nothing will exist in a wonderful state of, if ever achieved, without working to protect that state, or more reasonably reach for something better. But I don't count things as failures because they're flawed. I count them as things that need dire improvement and that we should be addressing. And we happen to be in a moment right now in American history where there are a lot of things that need addressing, and that are in peril or in crisis, and that are offering threats of various kind, political, constitutional, social, any other number of things. And because of that, it really matters right now that we have the awareness and that we do the work to make these things better, rather than stepping back and saying, well, they're flawed, so let's give up. That's tempting to do too. And I understand that impulse. Oh, well, democracy has never really worked here. Have we even ever wanted it? I don't know. So do we really want democracy? Yeah, we do, but we can be better at it. We can help make that, our democratic system, better. And I believe in that. I believe in democracy. I believe in our judiciary system and our legal system. And I believe that it has to be made better. And I can believe all of those things at the same time.
So they're nominating you to be in a local theater production of 12 Angry Women as the lead juror, just so you know. We'll talk about that in the after party.
I could be an angry woman on a jury for sure.
An all-female remake of 12 Angry Men was the chat going on. Okay, so Ellen is asking if you could speak to other times, other than the dual example you already gave, when the haves got lighter sentences or got away with stuff versus the have-nots. She says particularly people of color, non-privileged people. And Jonathan, to combine some very lengthy questions, he's asking, were there ever cases where the family turned around and sued the person who died at the duel for damages later?
Oh, interesting. I'm not, of the last one, in a sense, is the easiest one. I'm not aware of that. Not only that, but the elite people, this won't be surprising considering a lot about our current political climate. Elite folk kind of considered it to be their right to not get charged for breaking the law and fighting a duel. And when Aaron Burr gets charged with various charges for his part in the duel against the non-existent duel against Alexander Hamilton, a number of Jeffersonian Republicans in Congress create and sign a petition that basically says, we don't charge people for this. Like, we don't charge our kind with this law. So in a sense, what they don't use these words, but this is weaponized justice. Why are you picking on him? We never charge people, elite political people, with this crime, so he shouldn't be charged either. That's the degree to which there was an assumption that if you're elite, and these are the lawmakers, that you are entitled to be a lawbreaker, right? I'm not aware, and I'm not going to say, as a historian, I'm not going to say it never happened. This other question about a suit, I don't know, but I can't say I've ever seen that in what I've looked at. That's the second question. The first question, go back and remind me what it was.
She was asking if there were just other examples other than the duel where people that were wealthy got away with it.
Oh, well,
versus
the easy answer to
underprivileged
that
or people
is
of color.
the easy answer to that is yes, right? I mean, so I'm here sort of preaching for our judicial system, and I'm also would immediately step up and say it's flawed and biased in all kinds of ways. And I sometimes that has to do with the simple fact that rich people can afford a certain kind of lawyer that other people cannot. Sometimes that has to do with wealthy people, rich people, elite people, knowing insiders that can get them, so they can get out of things that they might be charged in other ways. There are all kinds of ways in which power and wealth and status and race can prime our legal system in your favor and against others. So even as I'm saying I believe in our system, I'm not saying at all that it's unflawed, or that it's seriously flawed and needs to be helped, fixed, remedied, at least improved. So the principle of what our system is, I have deep faith in. But yeah, all the time. I mean, I think I almost don't even have to name specific examples. We see that all the time, that someone of importance gets out of something because it's someone of importance. I mean, I even think of a case in 1856, I guess, in Washington, in which a member of Congress shot and killed a waiter at the Willard Hotel, my favorite hotel, because the member of Congress, California congressman, wanted breakfast served after the hour that breakfast was served. And when the waiter said, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't serve you breakfast. It's past the hour that breakfast can be served," the California congressman got angry and ultimately threw a chair, pulled a gun, and killed the waiter. And that went to trial. And the person who did the killing, surrounded by members of Congress and other people of importance, was basically found not guilty. So that happens all the time. And in that case, that came to mind only because the image that's in my mind is of this congressman surrounded by members of Congress and other important people in the courtroom. Like, yeah, okay, sure. Come at me, you can't. I'm an important person with political power. So yeah, our system has plenty of room for bias. Again, I think you can believe in the ideals that our system stands for and acknowledge that it's very, very flawed in the way it's operating at the same time, and believe that we can work towards making it better if people will acknowledge the flaw and will actually step away from the underlying sense of entitlement that some people feel about deserving not to be charged with crimes because of their status, their wealth, or their race.
Yeah, people in the chat are referencing the young man who got away with something from affluenza because he was too rich to know better. That was a famous case a couple of years ago. Okay, our favorite student, Sydney, is back.
Hello, Sydney.
Joined us in a little late, but Sydney was asking your thoughts on why people seem to have so many different ideas of what defines a democracy.
Well, okay, so part of my answer to that is going to be that we don't, and I'm not saying this is, I'm speaking to an audience of people, not all of them are teachers, but many are. So what I'm not going to say now is the teachers have failed us because they're not teaching civics. That said, I do think that some people fundamentally never have learned what democracy is. Maybe, and this gets far beyond education, people take it for granted, just generally speaking. And I've talked about that a lot over the past few years, that I think people assume that America is a certain way. It has always been this way. It will always be this way. It's always going to be safe. It's always going to be wonderful, that we are an exception to every rule, and democracy somehow falls into that category. Oh, it's democracy, like democracy survives, democracy is good, whatever. And we haven't had on a almost daily basis to consider the fact that democracy is fragile, that democracy requires work, that democracy can be overturned, that democracy can leave. And I think, so part of the answer to why are there so many definitions of it, part of the answer is I think people take it for granted and don't really think very hard about what it is. And it's part of why I talk about it all the time, right? Because I think it's so ingrained in so many Americans that democracy is this sort of ethereal in the air thing that makes America special, without actually thinking about the concrete realities that are required for that, or the fact that they can be taken away. It's like people can't, even now, even with, given all that we've seen politically and otherwise, even given all of the people like me who are constantly saying democracy is under threat, even with all of that, there are a lot of people who fundamentally cannot believe that, because it's so ingrained in many Americans that we don't fall victim to the kinds of things that affect other people. We're different, we're special, and we've always been okay, so we're going to be okay again. I always, when people talk to me about my work or about the Civil War period, and they want me to say, well, look, it was really bad before, and then we got through it. Now, first of all, yeah, we got through it. We also had a civil war, so come on. But that said, I don't want people to read my work about violence in Congress or political violence in the past, and the takeaway should not be, oh, it was really bad then, and look, we're still here, everything's fine. That's not the takeaway I want. I want people to say, oh, here are ways in which political violence in different ways over time has really threatened us as a nation, and it's doing it again. No two cases are the same. So you can't say, well, this worked in this case, this will work again in this case. You can't assume that. And that's part of the answer, again, to Sydney's question, is people like to make direct equivalence lines. Well, if this happened this way, then this will happen that way. And democracy equals this thing. And so we can define it this way. And then you end up in political situations where you can't make those kinds of direct comparisons. We're in a moment where all kinds of facts and fundamental assumptions are being challenged and even overturned. Norms, we've talked about them too, right? I always think of Cheers. I can't help it when I'm like, norms. But things that we've taken for granted, they're norms. That's how things work. They always have worked this way, and suddenly they're not. We're in a moment where it's disorienting, and I oddly enough, not for me, but I think for some people, it's probably easy to dismiss the inherent threat of that because it seems quirky and weird and we've been fine before. To me, the inherent threat of that is pretty ongoing. I'm up in the middle of the night because of these kinds of questions. But the short answer to Sydney's question is people don't agree on it because they haven't thought about it very much, because they haven't had to. And now we really, really need to, in a protective kind of way, in a way that really has to do with the big us, with the we that we are as a nation. And some people have really, really learned that, and some people really, really still have not.
Sydney was asking if everybody that gets a PhD at UVA becomes a Joanne. I told her, no, I live in this town. There's lots of PhDs, but there's only one Joanne. Okay, Dave has two very, very long questions. We don't have time for both of them, but I'm going to pick one. He's asking, how does the rule of law work in more recent times with this idea of court packing? He said, he talks about how Garland wasn't instated because it was a year out from the election versus Amy Coney Barrett getting rammed through at the last minute. All these, ethical considerations coming out with certain justices accepting gifts. He's asking, how can we, apply the rule of law here when it seems out of check and out of balance?
Right. Well, it is important to say that court packing and corruption are not new, right? That some of what we're seeing now, as much as it appears to be totally warping aspects of our judicial system, they've happened in different ways in the past. Again, the moral of this story is not, oh, so it's okay, it doesn't really matter very much. It really does matter. But these are also, so what do we have right now? We have some people saying, well, should there not be some kind of ethics law or code that Supreme Court justices have to abide by? That kind of question is partly a product of this moment. And it's the sort of thing, I don't know, I'm not going to rule one way or another as to that idea, but it's an interesting and good idea to put forward. And it represents in this moment reckoning with a lot of what we're seeing as far as, courts seemingly having some corruption within them, being in some ways packed or unfair. It's interesting that it feels as though, and this may or may not be accurate, but it feels as though there was a long period of time when Republicans were cramming people into courts in a very assertive, aggressive way that Democrats were not necessarily as keyed up on, and that we got to a certain point where suddenly everyone was like, whoa, the courts are really packed with these people. It feels as though some people on the right had a better sense of a long-term plan about the impact of this kind of thing than necessarily people were doing as assertively on the left. And I can't say that with great authority, so I'm not going to. But the idea that getting people into offices, making judges that agree with you in a very fundamental way, and sometimes doing that in ways that don't seem particularly fair or proper. That's pretty fundamental. That's been operating for a while. What we're living with now is the realization that that's where we are at a moment where some people are coming forth with really extreme partisan, and I'm going to say anti-democratic, again, largely on the right, ideas. And then suddenly we're confronted with, oh, this doesn't seem as though it is quite democratic. What do we do? Here are the courts, but the courts may or may not be able to reckon with this because of where the courts are right now. It's, how do I want to put this? We are at a moment where so many fundamental aspects of our political system, our sort of principles of government are being challenged. We need to be aware of the fact that we could take none of them, nothing, for granted. And that's a big statement. And I'm sure for some people, it's going to feel like we have to be in a constant state like this, like take nothing for granted. But I do think we have to be savvy, watchful Americans, because of all of the many ways in which, as far as the Constitution, as far as the implementation of the law, as far as the electoral process is concerned, as far as what partisan politics is doing or not doing, as far as the fundamentals of democracy, as far as institutions of government, we really need to be aware and alert and watchful about what we see around us. We need to not take for granted that things will stay as they are or that things will automatically get better. And we need to be loud with our voices and our votes when we see things that appear to be wrong, and not just with our votes, but with our voices. Votes are vitally important. Voting rights are yet another way in which things are being democracy is, or at least people are trying to undermine it by reeling back on some fundamental voting rights. But beyond elections, we need to be speaking up loudly and pointing our fingers at things that appear to be unfair in ways that can be heard, in ways that are not just one person or two person, but we can make a noise and point our finger in a way that can attract some attention and at least force some people to at least begin to reckon with some of the injustices and challenges to democracy that surround us all the time.
Yeah,
The questions were long, and my answers were long.
Yep, and we didn't get to all of them as usual, but that's okay. I think we got a lot of really good ones in. We might be able to squeeze a couple into the after party. Who knows?
Who knows? Let me explain that.
Was flying.
Pardon? The chat. I couldn't. Sometimes it's distracting on the bottom of the screen. It was going so fast. It was beyond even distracting me. So let me explain, because there are some new folks here, what's going to happen next. So we are now going to segue to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording our conversation so that we can be even freer and easier in what we talk about, and we can talk about whatever it is we want to talk about at all. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are, and within a minute or two, you will poof, be in the after party. If you are on Facebook, to get to the after party, you need to leave Facebook and you need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. ncheteach.org/conversations. Beam into where we are, join us through the NCHE website, and then you too, poof, will be in the after party too. I know that I went back to school this past week. I'm sure many of you out there will be, if you haven't already, will be in the week ahead. So I'm wishing everyone a good week. Also, if you're starting school, a good semester. I thank you as ever for beaming in here for the conversation of democracy. I've said beaming in about 8 times in 3 seconds. I apologize, but I thank you for taking part on a Friday morning in the conversation of democracy, which really matters, that we can have these conversations, that you can ask questions, that we can interrogate things, we can see what we think of them. We can talk about things that aren't working, things that need to be improved, and we can come together as a community to do that. Everything that we talk about here the fact that it's happening here matters. The fact that you can then take this away and have other conversations matters a lot too. In your classrooms or with friends and family or whoever, what we're doing here matters. So thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you to Annie and John, as ever, for being here and making this possible. It would not be possible without you guys. I don't know what I would do. I would do without seeing you guys every week. Actually, that applies to everyone, but particularly you guys. And even John, who I only get for like 3 minutes.
We were talking about that, like, what does John do behind that black box?
Oh, what does he do? At any rate, I realize we're long on time here, so I'm going to stop blathering now, and we will segue to the after party and see you guys all next week.
We're waiting for the voice now.
The voice.